quite fascinating. You know, both Ron and Don have recently been in Poland, so we'll hear some of that as well. But before we get going, I need to always do our commensurate thank you to the City and County of Broomfield for all their marvelous support, and certainly the Broomfield Community Foundation, SFCD, Denver Foundation. All of these groups have just been marvelous in their support for us, but above and all, the city has just been marvelous. We couldn't exist, without their, continual support. Just as the normal reminder, I know you've heard it all time, but good time to put your phone on mute so it won't ring. If you haven't become a member, we'd love to have you become a member of the museum. The number of members we have, we always report with the city, and they like to see that we have a basic core, which is all of you, obviously, who enjoy coming to the museum. And certainly any donations you make in our little jar upstairs is always appreciated and helps pay for our coffee and donuts and other stuff. This guy looks familiar, doesn't he? Well, anyway, just as a reminder, we have the marvelous exhibit upstairs on Operation Overlord, and come 5 November, we're switching it out.
It may be the week after.
Maybe the week after. Well, sometime in November. Let's put it that way. But anyway, it's a marvelous exhibit. The next one's going to deal with the Battle of the Bulge. Again, the 80th anniversary for that last momentous battle, at least on the Western Front. We also have the artwork by Noah Webb, who's up there. And Shar, it should be here. Shar is his wife. And is a volunteer with us as well. But that's some marvelous artwork. I'll highlight these are the last 3 CNCs for the year, this year. 9 November, Tyler Brunell's going to give us a marvelous history of the importance of the Lend-Lease Act, and particularly in our support, how we supported our European allies and shipped a lot of stuff to Russia as well. In fact, what was interesting when I looked at back my father's history, his first assignment was to prepare one of our old 4-stacker destroyers to be transferred to the British. The 23rd, Don's going to be back for a repeat, and I'm dragging in there as well, talking about the Battle of the Bulge, particularly in the northern sector, and of course, how the combat engineers had a big role in this thing. And then our last one's Saturday, 7 December. We had to do something on Pearl Harbor, but rather than repeat the story of it, we have a marvelous story locally as well. 2 local residents, Pete Peterson and Don Seibold, served on the USS West Virginia at different times. Pete was on it when it was sunk intact at Pearl Harbor. Don Seibold served on it later once it recovered, was put back in action, and the major battle of Surigao Strait in Leyte Gulf. And we'll have both daughters for them here to talk about their father. So again, I think that's a marvelous way to kind of end out our season. 11 November, don't forget that. That's our annual Veterans Day program. Keep your fingers crossed for good weather. It'll be right out front. Refreshments, music, guest speaker, all the normal stuff which makes it a fun day. So 11 November, it'll start at about 11. Come a little early, we'll have refreshments and stuff. And then just 2 reminders, I've already advertised it. We've been given information about a Mountain Range High School Veterans Day celebration. They're looking for veterans who would like to come join them for a breakfast, lunch, parade through the museum, and to talk to students. I have the handout here, which has more information. And additionally, the Knights of Columbus will be hosting a Veterans Tribute and Appreciation Breakfast. over in North Glen. So, Bob, I hope you might be able to attend that, since that's kind of where you live. And I also have both those items on a handout here, in case you haven't seen it and might have an interest. Both of them require an RSVP in advance. And I think that is about it. So we will, we may have some students with us today. Oh, that's great. There's seats, come on up front. Late student arrivals always sit up front. So there's some here. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. There will be a quiz at the end. So without further ado, let me.
Yes. I think the students are here about the mountain range event.
Oh, are you? Yeah. Oh, would you want to talk a little bit about it? One of you, come on up. Let me come back.
Mike, you're asking two teenage girls if they want to talk?
Bill, question? No, you'll hold it close.
Okay, so hi guys. Is it working?
Yeah.
Okay, hi guys. So I'm Leah Sullivan, and this is Trinity, and we're from Mountain Range High School. And on November 6th, from 8:30 to 12, we are having our Veterans Day celebration, and you guys pretty much can come in and talk to the students about your guys' experiences, and we'll have a parade around.
It's around like 11:20.
Yeah, it's like around 11:20ish, and we have flyers and stuff for you guys to sign up, and so we would really appreciate if you guys can make it and come. And so if you guys are interested, please let me know, and I can give you guys a flyer. And it's just a QR code that you scan and you fill out, and you guys get a shirt as well. So yeah.
Just one comment. You may have to check that QR code.
We
I
did.
tried that the last 2 days.
We fixed it.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
All right. We've done it, a bunch of us have done it in past years, and it's really well worth doing. So I've signed up, and I know we'll have some others here, so strongly encourage you, if you'd like to, please join us for that day. Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And again, we have their handout as well, so pick one up if at all you might be interested. Okay, Flint, you're up.
All right, is my slideshow ready to go here?
Get that up for you.
Okay. Well, Mike is working on this. Can you hear me okay back there? Okay. I'm Flint Whitlock. I'm on the board of directors of the museum and been volunteering here for about 8 years in charge of the display and exhibit committee. This talk came about because, well, a couple of reasons. One, I'm a lecturer on board Viking cruises, and just last month I was on a cruise through the Baltic. And one of the things that I do for Viking is I present lectures on how World War II impacted many of the countries that Viking visits. And this year we were going to go to Poland. And so I thought, well, this would be a good time to talk about the involvement of Poland in World War II and what went on there. Now, I'm not Polish, but I grew up in a community on the south side of Chicago that was probably about 50% Polish. I went to high school with kids who had no vowels in their last names. Think about that for a minute. It's a good thing we didn't have our names embroidered on the back of our football jerseys, because it would have gone down both sleeves, for some of them anyway. But at any rate, I got to do a lot of research on the topic of Poland in World War II, and as it turned out, we were stopping in Gdansk. The German name for that was Danzig, which was one of the first places that the Germans attacked on the 1st of September of 1939. Well, I happened to be there. Well, the crews happened to land there in Gdansk 3 days before the 80th anniversary or 85th anniversary of the start of the war. And the Poles were getting ready to commemorate this right there in the port where we were. So it was interesting to see these preliminary activities taking place. As it turned out, I was also in Berlin on September 1st, which is the exact 85th anniversary date of the start of World War II in Europe. And I was taking a tour of the city with a guide there we were on a bus driving around, and I noticed that some of the German flags were at half-staff, and I remarked to our guide, I said, oh, well, you know, today is a terribly important date in world history, September 1st, and she kind of looked at me blankly. She said, oh. I said, yeah, the start of World War II, you know, 85 years ago today. And I see that you have flags at half-staff as kind of probably a tribute to the start of the war and a remembrance of all those who died. And she said, no, they're at half-staff because a Muslim guy stabbed 3 Germans a couple of days ago. And I thought, wow. And I saw nothing in Berlin that even hinted at the significance of that date. And I thought that was, well, terribly unfair, to say the least. So anyway, I'm going to give you kind of a condensed version of the talk that I gave on board the Viking cruise line. And then when I'm done, then Don Cygan will come up and talk about one specific feature of the war in Poland called Rising 44. So we'll get started with, I'd like to do a lot of backstory stuff in all of the books that I've written. And I know all of you have read all of my books. You know that I love backstory. So I'm going to start with an abbreviated history of Poland. As you can see here on this map, it's located right in the heart of Central Europe. And because of its position, Poland's fortunes have waxed and waned over the centuries, buffeted by the forces of history. They've been invaded and fought over for hundreds of years. In the mid-1500s, Poland was Europe's largest and perhaps most powerful state. Yet during the partitions of Poland that took place between 1772 and 1918, it virtually disappeared and was parceled out to the various empires of Russia, Prussia, and Austria. After Germany's defeat in the Great War, many of the Polish politicians decided that they wanted to restore the country's pre-1772 borders to get back the land that they had lost to these other nations. At the same time, in Russia, Lenin, they had just had the Bolshevik uprising there and basically eliminated the Tsar and the Russian Empire. Lenin wanted to push his country's borders westward into Poland. The result was the Polish-Russian War of 1919 and 1920. Marshal Józef Pilsudski was Poland's first chief of state, and he basically ran the war against the Russian invasion. And it resulted in a Polish victory that established the Russo-Polish border that remained in place until the start of World War II in 1939. Talk a little bit about the Polish armed forces at the beginning of the war. How big were they? What were their capabilities? Well, they were fairly small. They had 400 divisions in the army, and a division was down, 10, 12,000 men, something in that range. They had an armored force of 475 obsolete tanks. You can see that this guy is almost bigger than the tank that he's in. They had an air force of 315 airplanes. They had a little over 16 warships, and they had 11 brigades of horse cavalry. We'll talk a little bit more about the lancers of the horse cavalry shortly. There was also kind of a home guard, a peasant militia that had received some rudimentary training, and they were kind of I guess you could call it last line of defense. Well, Adolf Hitler had been casting his eyes on Poland for a long, long time. One of the reasons was that it had Europe's largest Jewish population, and he had designs on the Jewish population. He wanted to wipe them out, as we all know. But also, Poland represented what they call Lebensraum, or living space. He felt that if he could conquer Poland, Germany could expand to the east, and they'd have plenty of room for crops, for cities, for expanding German population. And so that was really one of the reasons why he wanted to attack Poland. Hitler and Stalin didn't like each other. It's kind of an understatement. And they both distrusted each other. But Hitler said, well, if I lull Stalin and the Soviet Union into feeling like we're going to be buddies, maybe I can achieve some of the goals that I want to achieve. And so in 1939, I believe it was August 23rd of 39, the two foreign ministers of the Soviet Union, Molotov, and the German foreign minister, Ribbentrop, signed a pact that basically allowed both countries to attack Poland. It was a secret clause within this pact. It was kind of a friendship clause. As I mentioned, Hitler wanted to fool the Russians into thinking that they weren't also going to be attacked at some point. But this pact basically allowed those two countries to attack and divide up Poland as they saw fit. So Hitler needs an excuse. How am I going to attack Poland and not seem like it was just a bald-faced effort on Germany's part to grab the neighboring country? And it was started by what was called the Gleiwitz incident. How many of you have heard about the Gleiwitz incident? Okay, goodly number. Well, basically, this was a radio station, a transmitter on the border of Germany and Poland. Shows here where this radio tower and transmitter were located. And Hitler said, let's instigate a false flag attack. We will attack this transmitter on the night of August 31st of 1939, but we'll make it look like the Poles did it. So along with about 24 other incidents along the German-Polish border, the attack was manufactured by Germany as a casus belli to justify the invasion of Poland. What they did, the scenario was the attackers were not Polish, attacking a radio transmitter in Germany, but rather German SS soldiers in Polish uniforms. There were German concentration camp inmates who were taken out of the camp, murdered, dressed in Polish uniforms, and then laid out near the station and photographed for the press as proof of a Polish attack, kind of an early example of misinformation. The evidence of the attack by the SS was provided by an undercover SS officer named Alfred Naujax. And he was assisted by, here's a name you'll know, Oskar Schindler. I think we've all maybe seen the movie Schindler's List and know the story, how he saved Jews who were working in his factory. Well, at this point, he was actually a Nazi spy, and his agents were able to obtain the army uniform, Polish army uniforms that were used in this false flag attack. So now the war begins. It's September the 1st. And here we see Hitler sending his troops off on their invasion of Poland. Some news accounts and photographs of the drive into Poland. There was one of the German Navy's battleships was called the Schleswig-Holstein, and here's a picture of it before the war. And it was involved in the battle at Danzig or Gdansk. It's called the Battle of Westerplatte. That went on for a week in the beginning of September. And you see the map here showing where Danzig and Gdansk is located. This is kind of a close-up map. This was a peninsula called the Westerplatte, and this is where the Polish Army and Navy had a lot of facilities, and then this canal here was where the German battleship came down, and here's the city of Gdansk or Danzig. And so this is where, on the 1st of September, some of the first shots were fired. Some of the defenders of the Westerplatte. Here's the Schleswig-Holstein firing at the naval and army base there. And it took a week for the Germans to finally conquer the garrison. And here we see the Polish soldiers surrendering. And the fortress was kind of battered. The Germans are raising the Nazi flag over the fortress. When I was there in September, you can visit this area, and they've left the ruins of the barracks and some of the other buildings there as a memorial to those who died defending that area. And this is what's left of one of the barracks buildings. And after the war, they erected this very large monument and memorial to those Poles who were killed during World War II. They were getting ready for the 85th anniversary commemoration events while this was going on, and I wish I'd been there to be able to see that, but we were there 3 days too early. One of the major battles in the German takeover of Poland was the battle for the post office. Now, post office was not just a place where you mailed letters, but it was northern Poland's communications center. They had radio communications, telephone communications running out of this building, and so the Germans felt it was important to take this particular building, because if you can control the communications, you can control a lot of what happens afterwards. Here are some of the German troops moving up behind an armored vehicle at the post office. Here's kind of the ruins of the facade of the building once the battle was over. There were a number of, actually a small number of Poles who defended the post office building, both civilian and military. Here are a couple of the civilians there who were then taken prisoner by the Germans. Out in the back courtyard here, you can see the Germans have the Polish defenders of the post office lined up at the wall. And here they are being marched off to captivity. The building was blasted with explosives and artillery fire, and it was set on fire, but the defenders held out for 15 hours. Of the 56 defenders, over 30 of them died during the siege. The survivors were captured, tortured, put on trial, and most were executed by firing squad on October 5th, 1939. Now we get to the charge at Krojanty. Did I say that right? Okay. Here we see a picture of the Polish Lancers. It was a horse-mounted cavalry unit, and you can see that most of the soldiers there are carrying lances. And the battle took place on the evening of September 1st near the village of Krojanty, which is south of or southwest of Gdansk. And it's kind of become a very historic event because elements of a cavalry unit charged and dispersed a German infantry battalion. The Germans fought back with machine guns and armored cars and forced the Poles to retreat. But this attack did delay the German advance, which allowed other Polish infantry units in the area to withdraw. The Germans routed the Poles the next day, but the incident prompted false reports of Polish cavalry attacking German tanks after journalists see the bodies of horses and cavalrymen. The scene of the Polish cavalry charging panzers with lances remains a common myth. And this is a piece of German propaganda art. You can see this German tank is running over a horse here, and here a horseman is being dismounted off of his horse, and another lancer here in the back. So this is the kind of thing that the Germans put out that said, you know, how stupid are the Poles to attack our tanks with men on horses and lances. But it was a false representation of what really happened. So 3 days after Germany invades Poland, Britain and France declared war on Germany and touches off the European phase of World War II. On the 17th of September, Stalin says, okay, thanks to the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, I now have permission to invade Poland from the east. And so he sends a few 100,000 men across the border with Russia into Poland. And as you can see there, the newspapers were making a lot of, putting out a lot of information about this. And this is a political cartoon that shows a Russian soldier stabbing the Polish eagle, the national emblem of Poland, in the neck, kind of a stab in the back representation. So Germany decides they're going to take over the western half of Poland. They establish what they call the General Government, which was an administrative unit established by the Germans in October of 1939, consisting of the parts of Poland that had not been incorporated into the Third Reich during Hitler's invasion. It includes the districts of Warsaw, Krakow, Radom, Lublin, and Lwów. Hans Frank is appointed the Governor General, and he is hanged at Nuremberg after the war as a war criminal because of the atrocities that took place in Poland. The president of Poland at that time was Władysław Raczkiewicz. Thank you. And he became the president after the previous president resigned, but he had to flee to France after his country was taken over. And then he was able to get to Britain in 1940 to lead the Polish government in exile. Władysław Sikorski then becomes the prime minister of the Polish government in exile in England and commander-in-chief of the Polish armed forces. Sikorski supports the reestablishment of diplomatic relations between Poland and the Soviet Union, which is, it kind of blows my mind why he would even consider that. But he did. But in July of 1943, he was riding in a plane that crashed into the Mediterranean immediately after it took off from Gibraltar and killed everybody on board except the pilot. He had been the most prestigious leader of the Polish exiles, and his death was a severe blow to the Polish cause. The exact circumstances of the crash and his death have been disputed and have given rise to various theories surrounding the crash. So after the fall of Poland, many Polish units and soldiers made it to France, but when France basically surrendered to Germany in May of 1940, tens of thousands of these troops were able to get to Britain to continue their training. Here we see some pictures of Polish troops training in Britain. There was an airborne division that was established, and it also trained in Britain. And there were 2 squadrons of Polish airmen who took part in the Battle of Britain in shooting down German aircraft as well. So the Poles were, you know, even though their country had been overrun, the fighting men were still on the job. The Poles had a brief incursion in the Middle East under Władysław Anders, and the name Anders is associated as an informal common name of the Polish armed forces in the East in the 1941-42 period. These are the people who couldn't get to Britain and went in a different direction, and it was called Anders' Army. The army is created in the Soviet Union, but in March of 42, based on an understanding between the British, the Polish, and the Soviets, it's evacuated from the Soviet Union and makes its way through Iran and Syria to Palestine. There it comes under British command and provides the bulk of the units and troops of the Polish Second Corps, which is a member of the Polish Armed Forces in the West, which fights in the Italian campaign. Anders' army is notable for having been primarily composed of liberated POWs, and for Wojtek, a bear who was an honorary soldier. Here's Wojtek, cute little guy. He's a Syrian brown bear from the mountains of Iran, brought by Polish soldiers when they left the Soviet Union. In order to provide for his rations and transportation, he's officially enlisted as a soldier with the rank of private and is subsequently promoted to corporal. And he was a tame bear. He was well trained. He would carry ammunition boxes on his back. I don't know if he did KP or wash the dishes or licked them clean, or but he was a favorite with the troops. He accompanied the Polish Second Corps to Italy, served with an artillery supply company during the Battle of Monte Cassino in Italy. Wojtek helped move crates of ammunition and becomes a celebrity. And after the war, he's mustered out of the army and lives until 1963 at a zoo in Scotland. That's one of the happier stories that come out of the whole Polish tragedy.
Supposedly, he ate a lot of cigarettes that they fed him, and he also drank Polish beer, too.
Yeah, he was a regular soldier. I think they even taught him how to salute. But Poland becomes a place where Stalin, the Soviet Union, commits a number of crimes. On Stalin's orders, the NKVD, which I think was the secret police of Russia, carries out a series of mass executions of almost 22,000 Polish military and police officers, border guards, and intelligentsia POWs. The most notorious is the Katyn massacre near Smolensk that takes place over a 2-week period in March of 1940. This is a German propaganda poster showing Russians in the upper right about to shoot a Polish officer in the back of the head, and we see bodies that are in the trench here that have already been killed. This is known as the Katyn Forest Massacre, and there were 4,200 bodies that were uncovered there by the Germans. Stalin blames the Germans. He said they're the ones who did it, not us. We're the good guys. But after the war, I believe it was Gorbachev who admitted that it was actually the German or the Russians who did this killing. Poland also became the killing ground for the Nazis, as well as, I think we all know, there were 40,000 concentration camps that the Germans established all across the conquered territories. This just shows some of those in Germany and parts of France and Poland, but we don't have 40,000 dots there. There's not enough room for that. The Nazis also established 6 death camps in Poland. Probably the most famous is the Auschwitz-Birkenau camp. There was Belzec, Chelmno, Majdanek, Sobibor, and Treblinka. And this is where the Jews were transported from all over Europe to be systematically murdered. On our cruise, we stopped just outside of Gdansk at a place called the Stutthof concentration camp. And this was one of the camps that was established there. We see the camp under construction here. It was built by the prisoners themselves under the direction and orders of the Germans. Here we see Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, visiting Stuttgart, Stutthof. I was in Stuttgart for a while, so he's visiting Stutthof here in November of 41. some scenes inside of Stutthof where the conditions were terrible and the prisoners were very badly treated. This was the headquarters building back in the early 40s, and it's still there today. Visitors can visit this building. Here's the entrance to the camp. You see in the background some of the rebuilt barracks and some foundations of barracks showing where they were. There's a few train cars showing how many of the prisoners were transported to the camp from various parts of Europe. There's a collection of shoes, tens of thousands of shoes that were confiscated from the prisoners when they arrived. In 2017, Prince William and Princess Kate of Great Britain visited Stutthof. Here they are entering one of the restored barracks. Let's talk a little bit about the ghettos in Poland. I think we've all heard of the Warsaw Ghetto, and that was one of just several. I think there were something like 16 major ghettos in Poland. One of them is called Łódź. It looks like it should be pronounced Lodz, but it's actually Łódź in Polish, Don tells me. And it's located here just to the south and west of Warsaw. And there was a major ghetto there, but also in Warsaw. I'll show a few slides of that. It was concentrated kind of in the center of the city. Some views of what the camp looked like, or the ghetto. And it was basically a self-operating city under the direction of the Nazis. You can see on the top of this tramway a Star of David. So this identifies it as being within the ghetto. Another tram car with a Star of David on it. And life was difficult. It looks, pretty nice here, but life was actually very difficult because of the restrictions that the Germans placed on the inhabitants. To get from one side of the ghetto, crossing a street that wasn't a part of the ghetto, the residents had to go up and over bridges such as this one, crowded conditions. This is a photo that was taken of some of the residents, and I've always puzzled about this one because they're all smiling for the camera. There's one guy in the middle who's got a dog on his shoulder. They look happy. I don't know what the photographer said to make them smile, but they certainly were not happy. It was a very grim existence. Everyone in the ghetto had to wear a yellow star attached to their clothing. If you were found without the yellow star, you were subject to punishment, including death. There were Jewish police officers who maintained order within the ghetto. And here's a group of people lining up at a soup kitchen with their soup bowls to get some rations. But it was a really awful existence, and the longer it went on, the worse it got for the people inside. They were literally dying on the streets, and it was just a terrible situation. So it was decided to kind of clean out the ghetto. There are 460,000 Jews that were crammed into a little over 1 square mile. And in the spring of 1942, under the guise of resettlement, there were mass deportations that began, and over 250,000 were shipped out to be killed at the Treblinka Extermination Center, 50 miles northeast of Warsaw. Those who were left behind said, well, we're probably next. We're not just going to be slaughtered like sheep, so let's do something about it. And in January of 43, just as another sweep of the ghetto was made, the people living there who had been stealing weapons and making Molotov cocktails decided to fight back, and they fought against the Germans who went into the ghetto. And in April of 43, thousands of German troops then stormed the ghetto, burning and blowing up buildings. And by the time the 9-day battle ended, over 56,000 people had died in the fighting, and the ghetto is leveled. Here we see some scenes of the buildings being burned, people being rounded up out of the cellars and sewers where they had taken refuge, and they're marched out of the city. Some are loaded on trucks or taken to the railroad station and loaded into cattle cars and sent off to Treblinka, the death camp there.
This is going to be the topic of Don's talk.
Well, he's going to talk about the Warsaw Rising, which is separate from the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. Yeah, so there are two uprisings. I'm going to skip over what pertains to him, but this gives you an idea what the ghetto looked like after the Germans put it down. The total death toll among the prisoners of the ghetto is estimated to be at least 300,000 killed by bullet or gas when they went off to the concentration camps, combined with 92,000 victims of starvation and diseases and the casualties of the final destruction of the ghetto. This leads to what they call Operation Tempest, inspired by the ghetto uprising in February of 1943. Stefan Rovecki, the leader of the Polish Home Army until his arrest by the Gestapo in June of 43, drafts a plan for a national armed uprising throughout Poland called Operation Tempest, and I think that's what Don is going to focus on. His plan is to attack the Germans as they retreat westward, prevent reprisals against civilians, and most importantly, secure important Polish cities before the Soviets can take over. They're thinking that the Soviets are going to come in, kick out the Germans, and save them. The final aim of the Soviet Union is to transform Poland into a vassal communist republic, or simply into the 17th Soviet Republic. This is a statement made by one of the exiled Polish government members. Rovecki is captured by the Germans. He's executed upon the personal order of SS Chief Heinrich Himmler. But Tempest will not die. It will lead to the Warsaw Uprising in August of 44. That Don will cover. Meanwhile, what's going on in the rest of the war? Well, June 6th of 44, we all know, Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion of Normandy takes place. A few weeks later, Operation Bagration, which is the Soviet Army invasion of Germany from the east, takes place. So Germany is now being squeezed from both directions. And now the Warsaw Uprising takes place. I'll let Don cover that. But I want to say a few words about the Polish army in Europe. Here we see some of the soldiers being reviewed by Churchill in Great Britain. And they had about 400,000 men who were serving in the Polish army. Here's Anders' army fighting in Italy, 43 to 45. The Battle of Monte Cassino takes place. There are 4 or 5 attempts to take the German position atop of Monte Cassino. And it's finally the last battle is conducted by the Poles. We see some of the Polish soldiers attacking the monastery where the last German soldiers were holding out. And they captured Monte Cassino on May 18th, 1944. How many of you have ever visited Monte Cassino? Anybody? No? Okay. Up behind the restored monastery, they've rebuilt the monastery. It's amazing how they restored it. There is this large Polish cemetery that has over 1,000 graves of Polish soldiers there as a resting place, a final resting place for the men who lost their lives trying to take Monte Cassino. The Polish army entered France in late July of 44. They're supplied with American and British equipment and uniforms. They take part in Operation Cobra, which is the breakout from the Normandy beachhead. They take part in the Battle of the Falaise Gap in August of 44. Here we see Polish troops moving down towards a place called Mont Ormel, the high ground in that area. and the Germans are being pinched into a very narrow area called the Corridor of Death, where tens of thousands of them were basically slaughtered. They had no way of getting out. So we get to the Battle of Mont Ormel, showing where it is. Germans are trying to escape through this very narrow corridor, and they're trying to attack Mount Ormel, but they are also decimated in their efforts. And the Poles declare victory in that battle. And at Mount Ormel today, there is a memorial to the Polish troops and a museum there as well. Operation Market Garden comes along. This was the effort to cross the rivers on the western border of Germany. The Polish 1st Airborne Division takes part in this effort. They take part in the Battle of Driel near Arnhem. Stanislaw Sosabowski is the commander of the Polish 1st Independent Brigade at the Battle of Arnhem and takes part in Operation Market Garden. How many of you ever seen the movie A Bridge Too Far? All right, you might remember that Gene Hackman plays Sosabowski in that movie. At least they have a similar mustache. Now we get to the end of World War II, and I have a brief epilogue here. The Soviet Union asserts its dominance over much of Eastern Europe and creates what Churchill called the Iron Curtain. They put up the Berlin Wall that separates East Berlin from West Berlin and basically partitions off East Germany from West Germany. So after the war, Poland comes under the control of the Communist Polish People's Republic, but the Polish government in exile remains in existence, but without any real political power. For 46 years, the communists rule Eastern Europe. Many things happened there that weren't very good for the citizens. The Hungarians revolt in 1956. That's brutally put down by the Soviets. The same year, there's a revolution in Poland in October, and Władysław Gomułka, head of the Polish United Workers' Party, kind of takes over. People think that maybe there's going to be a little bit of freedom, but Gomułka kind of disappoints everybody. He doesn't turn out to be the savior and liberator as everyone was hoping. But there is a final triumph for Poland, and I think it starts with Pope John Paul II when he is elected Pope in 1978 by the College of Cardinals. It's the first time a non-Italian has been elected Pope of the Catholic Church. And I think his election hastened the collapse of communism in Poland and throughout Eastern Europe. And I think we remember in 1980, this electrician who worked in the Lenin shipyards in Gdansk, Lech Walesa, is elected to lead the strike that results in the creation of the Solidarity movement that eventually topples the Polish government. In May of 1989, the Polish government falls along with communist regimes throughout Eastern Europe, beginning a rapid transformation into democracies. And Walesa receives the Nobel Peace Prize and wins the national election in 1990 and becomes Poland's first democratically elected president and serves as the president of Poland from 1990 to 95. In 91, Poland joins the Council of Europe. On December 25th of 91, Gorbachev resigns his post as the president of the Soviet Union, leaving Boris Yeltsin as president of the newly independent Russian state. And now we know that the Soviet Union has collapsed and everything's wonderful in the former Soviet Union, right? It took 52 years, but the ultimate triumph of Poland is now complete. So I want to turn the microphone over to my friend Don Cygan. Maybe Mike is giving out an apple.
I think what we're going to do first.
Okay.
I know some of you must have some questions.
Ah.
I know Flint's got to take off because he's giving another talk.
Down in Castle Rock.
But we probably have time for a couple questions?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Well, David?
So,
David?
400,000 Polish soldiers managed to end up fighting for the Allies.
Mm-hmm.
That's a huge number.
Mm-hmm.
You got the Soviet Union to the east, you got Germany to the west, and you have Czechoslovakia, which is under German control, to the south. How the hell did 400,000 get out?
Well, maybe Don will touch on this, but through various ways and means, many of them after the Germans had invaded Poland and the Soviet Union too, went west to France and were able to, I don't think they were necessarily involved in the Dunkirk evacuation, but they found other ways. Other ships were, going up the west coast of France and into Britain. The others, I think, probably were able to escape from the Soviet Union because the Soviets did allow them to train, in the Soviet Union, and so maybe some of them, crossed the Baltic and made their way that way, and some through the Middle East, Syria, Iran, Palestine, and may have gotten out that way. That's an area that I haven't done a lot of research on to know exactly how 400,000.
That's a big number.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
You said 40.
Yeah.
How long did it take Germany to invade Poland? How many days was it? And do you think that the Polish people knew that it was coming? Did they have a sense, or was it a total surprise?
I'll let Don touch on that, but the collapse was fairly swift. It was less than a month.
And the primary reason really was there was a lot of historical afterthought that Poland probably could have resisted for much longer if it hadn't have been for the Soviet invasion. So getting attacked from both sides was really what put the hammer or the nail in the coffin for
Yeah.
Poland, unfortunately. So it was about a month.
Yeah. Anybody else? Okay, I'd like to turn it over to Mike.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
You had another talk to go to.
Yeah, I'll stay for a while.
Okay. If you want to get a refill for coffee, we have it. We have lots of donuts outside. And we have a marvelous bag of these delicious apples, which Charlene has brought in.
Yeah, sorry, we should have brought some pierogi. I think that's okay.
So anyway, if you want to take
Polish sausage.
Yeah.
go get a coffee, then come back and we'll be ready to go. Yeah, you can go out that way.
Hey, David, how you doing?
Good to see you.
Howdy. Good. Yeah, sure. Well, I was looking at my calendar, and I think I can make the 5th.
I don't think we're going to do the 5th
Okay.
because it's election day,
Yeah, it's true.
and some of our people, our volunteers
yeah, of
are
course.
also election workers. So it's probably going to be the week after.
Oh, shoot,
So
that's
if
when I'll be
you
gone.
Can drop off any artifacts.
I will leave
before
the
you go
stuff.
on your trip.
Yeah, I'll leave the stuff I brought, and maybe I'll put it in the room there with Elizabeth.
Yeah.
The thing I would caution
Put
you
a note
about,
on it. That's
right?
from you.
Thing I caution you about is that sign that I made. It's a replica of
Yeah,
the
yeah,
Bastogne
yeah.
sign. I never burred the edges on it, so it's a little sharp. So be
Okay,
careful
well,
if you're
we'll be
handling it. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Don't want anybody cutting
Thank
their
you.
fingers.
Taking a Viking cruise with my sister for a big birthday in October, so maybe we'll see you.
They're great cruises, and this guy is an awesome speaker to experience. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
How are you, Ann?
I'm freezing cold, but other than that.
Yeah,
I'm
it's a little
okay.
chilly down here. Yeah, it's a little
AC going
chilly.
on full blast.
I think so. Yeah.
So, hey, did you get my emails with my suggestions?
I did. Yeah, yeah. We'll take a look at a couple of those, and like I said, if we have some ideas for you guys, we will
Okay.
definitely send them your way.
Thank you.
So,
No, usually you respond to me and you didn't, so I was just wondering if you had
Yeah,
gotten them.
no,
And it's okay that you didn't, but
Yeah.
it's fine.
It's been busy.
Thank you so much for a great presentation. I'm from Poland, actually.
Oh, okay.
Wonderful, wonderful. Glad to
Cześć.
meet you.
Nice to meet you. Cześć.
Dzień dobry.
Dzień dobry.
Jadwiga?
Jadwiga, yeah, of course.
How
Tak.
long have you been in the
My
U.S.?
sister-in-law's maiden name is Peter Zach.
There you go.
This event, and I thought, I'm going to go. I would like to see what they did. Yeah, it's
And I said to her one time, what does it mean? And she said, Peterson.
Yeah, basically. I would imagine in Polish, yeah, it's just Peterson. I didn't notice, he left some of these, oh my gosh. I got to stay away from those things. They're so good. They're so yummy. They're those Rice Krispie
When
treats,
they
yeah.
first came out, they were so super sweet, they were awful.
I know. They were like impossible to eat. And then they had like the chocolate covered ones and the strawberry covered, yeah. It's too much.
I might go out to my car and get another layer of gold.
Yeah.
I mean, he was always preaching the truth. He had to go there because he was saying that actually Russia was invited.
Were you ever able to listen to Radio Free Europe?
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
but that was, you are not
You
allowed.
can't do
Yeah,
that?
yeah.
6 o'clock. Yeah, they call this Radio Wolna Europa. So that was Radio Free Europe. Yeah.
We have a little exhibit upstairs on Radio Free Europe and the
I
shortwave broadcasts that were made, so.
I would have to come here because I don't know about this museum. So I would have to have it come here and have a tour because now and I know.
Oh, it's a great
I
museum.
really would like to. Yeah, and I would invite my family members too. So we would just.
Oh, yeah, wonderful.
Yeah, so you did it.
Please.
Jadwiga, where are you from in Poland?
I went to Western Jagiellonian University. So I
Yes,
lived in
okay.
Krakow for a long
Krakow,
time, but I'm like 7 miles from the Ukrainian border.
Okay.
So that part.
Shimshal or that area? Or?
Close to Sanok.
Okay.
Close to Shikidone. It's kind of like a really close to Lviv, like over there.
Right, a little too close to Ukraine, maybe. Right.
It's too close.
Yeah, a little scary.
Yeah, it is. But anyway,
Well, how were you able to get out of Poland?
Oh, pardon me.
I went to Western Michigan University. So and I did my school, and I just think I was ready to go back, but then I met my husband, and I just stayed here. But we tried to go. I can go for a while, but recently, So I would like to take we would like to take the trip, the Viking trip, and cruise, and just hopefully we can you can give us a tour.
Well, I don't know if I'm going to be doing any trips in the near future. I've done for this year, but they usually have me do the Baltic and the Mediterranean.
Oh, that's good to
So
know.
I have a chance to talk about how World War II impacts both of those areas. But they haven't, signed me up for anything for next year or thereafter. So we'll just wait and see.
Yeah, we'll see. Yeah, but that was a great presentation. So
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it. Especially coming from a Polish person.
Yeah, exactly.
If you said that was terrible, your accent was awful, don't ever come back.
I was teaching Polish at the Polish school because we have a Polish school in St. Joseph.
All right,
Alrighty.
round two.
Grab a. Oh, pardon me. Grab a little snack. He's good.
God bless the Poles. What they accomplished is nothing short of miraculous.
Yeah, and they were everywhere. I mean, everywhere in Europe, in the Middle East, and everywhere they could be. They could fly everywhere.
It's definitely a diaspora. Yeah. Right side.
Okay, everybody takes an apple.
An apple. You like the sword? The saber? Shovel?
What's all this?
This was some stuff that was printed off at the Warsaw 44 Museum. And it's in Polish.
talking? Because I don't have to leave here.
20, 30 minutes. Stay as long as you can, Flint, but I get it. No problem. Yeah. This is an interesting book. It was actually my dad's. When he was in the Navy, he got a copy.
Oh, yeah?
And it's pretty rare to find these old World War II books that talk about World War II, you know. This one had some maps. They've kind of fallen apart. It's all about the invasion. Rogativka that I picked up, this hat, when I was in Poland. I still wear those in the Guard.
A lot of this stuff in your attic or your basement?
Yeah, you know, here and there.
All right, I just wanted to see what these.
Oh, yeah, sure.
But I'll be listening in the other room.
Okay.
Hey, Don,
Yeah.
if you can remember, are you going to use that map?
Yeah, actually, I may.
If you would put it back in the
That's yours?
ETO room.
Yeah.
We've got a blank space on the wall there next to Fritz.
Oh, yeah.
Be a
Yeah,
good
yeah.
spot.
Hey, did you like my idea about that? I am. I believe so. So, yeah. Okay.
Can't hear you. I mean, you're just talking.
Hello? No mic? Oh, that's interesting. It has a little green light on it. I wonder if the battery went out.
We don't hear him.
Hello?
Or we can give him this one.
Yeah, we could take that one real quick.
Well, I've been hearing him, but maybe he's been a little.
Hello?
You're green. No, red's on. Oh, red's up.
Yeah. Hello?
Bob, can you hear it?
Hello? Okay. All right. I guess it's working.
Speak loud.
I will talk loudly. Yeah. All right.
All yours.
Okay. Dzień dobry, cześć, and pan and pani, which basically means hello, good day, ladies and gentlemen. I do know just the tiniest smattering of Polish, but very, very little. But my family is Polish American, and that's one of the reasons why this subject has always been fascinating to me. The history of Poland, but also the history of Eastern Europe in general. It's not something that most Americans know a whole lot about. Usually we're more familiar with the history of Western Europe, or of course the history of our own country. It is kind of ironic that both Flint and I were in Poland at almost the exact same time. We did overlap a little on our trip, so I think that while Flint was up in Gdansk, I was down in Poznan, and darn it, if there hadn't been about 500 miles between us, we probably could have gotten together for a beer. Yeah. And a pierogi, yeah. But one of the things is that Flint and I talked about doing this as kind of a joint presentation. His work that he does with Viking, wonderful kind of overview of Polish history, especially what was happening during World War II. And I told him that I would love to kind of chime in a little bit about the Warsaw Uprising, because part of my trip was visiting Warsaw. And while I was in Warsaw, it was only about 2 weeks after they had celebrated the commemoration of the Warsaw Uprising. So there was still a lot of stuff going on. And as you'll see, some of the celebrations they had, some of the memorials that they had were really striking. Very interesting to see. Right here is a photograph. And this picture I took on the right, down Złota Street, taking a look towards what they call the old wedding cake version of their town hall, which was built by the communists back in the 60s. And you'll see a comparison with what that looked like with barricades that were thrown up during the Warsaw Uprising. and that black and white picture on the left there. So it's kind of a before and after view. And one of the things that's most striking about this photo, you'll notice, is that none of the buildings are there anymore. They've all been replaced. And that was one of the things that really hit me about Warsaw. If you've ever traveled to Warsaw, almost the entire city has been rebuilt after World War II. They had to, because 85 to 90% of the city was completely destroyed. And this is a large major city in Europe. So we have to kind of think in terms of like what would happen if all of Denver had been flattened in a war. And it's really amazed me how the Poles have rebuilt since that time. Let's see if I can, there we go. So one of the things I thought is, instead of going into details on the uprising itself, to talk a little bit about some of the myths that we've heard about the uprising. The Warsaw Uprising, known as the Powstanie Warszawskie, was an unorganized, untrained, poorly planned mob of desperate civilians. We often think that's what it was. We see pictures, we see men, women, children running around with weapons, fighting over the barricades, and we think it was just this hodgepodge of crazy civilians that were trying to fight against the Nazis. But that was not the case. Now, it is commonly referred to as an uprising, but many of the Poles do not like the use of that word. They refer to it as a rising, because an uprising sounds like it was an illegal activity. And to the Poles, of course, this was not illegal, claiming their city and taking it back from the Nazis. Another myth is that the Germans controlled the conflict from the beginning and the uprising was easily put down. Not the case. Another myth was due to prejudice, there was no coordination with the Polish Jews. Flint had mentioned the ghetto uprising of the Jews had taken place the year earlier. And actually there was a lot of coordination. There was still some prejudice, that's for sure. But there was a lot of coordination between the Polish Gentiles and the Polish Jews. The problem with the ghetto uprising in '43 is the Jews knew they were going to get liquidated. The Nazis were going to come in and drag them all out to the concentration camps. So even though the Polish Gentiles, the member of the uprising, they were telling the Jews, hold off, and we could coordinate this whole uprising together, the Polish Jews had no choice. They had to fight back as soon as they could. So unfortunately, they couldn't wait any longer. The Poles only used captured Nazi weapons, uniforms. The Red Army deliberately let the uprising fail when they could have easily helped the Poles. There's some truth to this, but you'll see it's a little bit more complicated than that. The Western Allies also could have helped the Poles, but failed to assist them in any way. Actually, that's sort of a myth too. We tried, but as you'll see here, it wasn't the easiest thing to resupply the Poles. Now let's talk about two governments. We need to understand this before we talk about the uprising. First off, as Flint had mentioned, we had the Polish government in exile, which was in London during this time period, 1944. Now, from time to time, I will refer to it maybe as the London government or the Sikorsky government. And even though Sikorsky had been killed in that plane crash, it was still sometimes kind of known as the Sikorsky government, just like in honor of him, because he was such a monumental figure. But there was another government in exile too, and that was one that had pretty much been put together by Joseph Stalin in Moscow from several Poles who had fled to Russia after Operation Barbarossa. And that was, of course, the Nazi invasion of Russia. And that's when Stalin all of a sudden started thinking to himself, I think maybe I need these Poles, and I need some of them to help fight my army and take Poland back. But I'm going to hand-pick those Polish people and make sure that they are the communists, right? So Poland did have a small communist party prior to World War II. And of course, Stalin's going to hand-pick people out of there and set up an alternative government in exile in Moscow known as the PKN, okay? But obviously the London government does not recognize these people as legitimate successors to Poland after the war. There was even a People's Army that was put together of 30,000 Poles, And you can see that's a much smaller number than the 400,000 we were talking about, which fought in the West. Okay, but this is giving Stalin some sort of, credibility that he has the true Polish government here to take over after the war is ended. There was also Berling's army, which was a Red Army unit, which was made up of Poles, although Zygmunt Berling was seen as a traitor. After the invasion of Poland in 1939, he had kind of run off to the Russians. So many in the Sikorsky government did not care for him. Zabroni na Wschód, which is taken east. Yes, so I wanted to just kind of touch on Katyn, which is what Flint was talking about earlier, this massacre of Poles that was done by the Soviets. And in 1940, nearly 22,000 Polish military officers, university professors, government leaders, et cetera, were executed in these mass killings by the NKVD. They were kind of the predecessor of the KGB. German troops discovered the mass graves, and I think Flint had mentioned that, in 1943. Interesting thing, the Germans went to the International Red Cross and they said, we didn't do this. And you can imagine the International Red Cross and the rest of the world opinion was like, yeah, right. But they did. They actually brought in people from the International Red Cross and they proved to them that the Soviets had done this. But Stalin denied it. And Stalin, of course, pointed the finger back at the Nazis and said, no, they did it. So this becomes a huge bone of contention with the Polish government in exile in London. And it pretty much ended relationships between the Polish government in exile and the Soviet government under Stalin, because they kept pushing Churchill and FDR and the Western leaders to get the truth out about Katyn. What happened here? Were the Soviets really responsible? And they were. And the Poles knew that, but they couldn't get anybody to help them with getting the Soviet government to admit this. Now you might recognize the last name. Yeah, and I went to the Katyn Museum when I was in Warsaw and discovered probably 5 different Cygans, which is the Americanization of my name. It's actually Cygan in Polish. But there were several that were there, including this one, which we're sure that we are related to this gentleman. He grew up in the area where my dad's family comes from, which is in Galicia, which is near Krakow. So we believe that he is definitely a member of our family. He was murdered there in 1940. So the underground resistance, the national resistance, which was known as the Wojsko Polskie, I think I pronounced that correctly, and the home army was known as the Armia Krajowa. These were 2 different groups which kind of come about after 1939. Those surviving Polish military officers and soldiers, they kind of create this underground resistance, this partisan resistance. But it was made up of many different groups, and this was part of the problem. You can see all the different political parties, organizations that were part of this overall Polish underground. Some of these groups were on the far right. The National Party was almost fascist. And a few of these groups were on the far left. They were basically communist groups. The Communist Party, obviously, Polish Socialist Party, the Peasants' Brigades, these were communist groups that were mostly controlled by Moscow. But all of these groups do have one goal, and that is obviously kicking the Nazis out of Poland and liberating Poland. Yes?
What are go back to that last slide. What are gray ranks?
The Gray Ranks were just another group, and I believe they were primarily made up of, interestingly enough, scouting organizations. Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, like this. So there were these paramilitary youth organizations in Poland, like there were throughout most of the countries of the world. You know, we have the Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts. The Germans had the Hitler Youth and all these different organizations like that. So, Tadeusz Berkmorowski, I think I pronounced it correctly. That's a tough one. that was actually his code name. I think Burr meant forest or woods. All of these guys had code names in the resistance. He was the one who was basically put in charge of this coalition of all these groups. He was ordered by London to begin this uprising as the Soviets started to get closer and closer to Warsaw in 1944. Afterwards, he served as prime minister of the London government, but then he kind of falls into obscurity as Poland becomes controlled by the communists. The home army in Warsaw. Here's where we get to breaking down some of these myths. The home army was actually not just a throw-together group of partisans and guerrillas. It was actually an army. And they wanted to be recognized as an army. They were organized, they were trained. Most of their leaders were indeed former military members of the Polish army. They had a strong command structure, though there were these independent battalions in each one of the neighborhoods in the cities, and especially in Warsaw. They had their own medical corps, their own logistic corps. They had courts. They even had pilots, saboteurs, engineers, weapons makers. They could be very ruthless if they found that there were traitors amongst their midst. They did have a specific group who held like a court, and they would take them out back and they would execute them. They found they were working for the Nazis. And they did employ certain civilian groups as well as kind of auxiliaries, like we mentioned the Polish Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, as couriers, nurses, scouts, secret spies, that kind of stuff. You can see the youth and the age of some of these individuals who were not much more than maybe 12, 13, 14, who were working in these organizations secretly in Warsaw.
They look like they're female.
There are some. Yeah, there were. There were definitely, and we'll show you a few of them in just a little bit. Here's the interesting thing, weapons too. We always think that, well, you know, the uprising, all they did was just capture weapons from the Nazis and use those against the Nazis, and that's true for the most part. But to show you how on top of things the Polish Home Army was, in Warsaw they actually had underground factories where they were building weapons. Filipinka was a special type of grenade surrounded by a ceramic. The machine gun down there, they actually manufactured a machine gun. They had gun presses and they had metallurgy, and they had a factory that was cranking out machine guns that they kept secret from the Nazis. But they also had to rely on former Polish army weapons that had been smuggled away, secret depots, private firearms, Russian weapons that had been smuggled in. And a couple of weapons later in the uprising were airdropped by the Western Allies. But they really never had enough, as you can imagine.
What is SOE?
SOE was the Special Operations Group, kind of the precursor to the Special Forces, or CIA, during World War II. Artillery was one thing, of course, they were lacking. And here's one of the big problems with the uprising. They didn't have that ability to get huge cannons or bomber aircraft or these type of things. They did capture a couple of German tanks. They gave them some interesting little cute names like Poodle, after they painted it up in Polish colors here. And they built an armored car in a factory, Kubus, which was basically this kind of blocked out truck with metal sheets over it. They did capture a lot of German weapons, as we know, and used them against the Nazis. So August 1st is when this Operation Tempest that Flint had mentioned, the uprising, is scheduled to take place. It's supposed to coincide with the Soviet offensive in Lublin, but the timing is everything, and this is the problem with the uprising here. And the Polish leaders like Komorowski know this. If you do this too soon, then the danger is basically that the Germans will put it down before the Soviets reach Warsaw. If you do it too late, then the Soviets have already taken Warsaw, and they can put Warsaw under their heel before the Poles have any say in taking the city. So there is this very, very delicate moment that the Poles have to take advantage of. Too soon, too late, it's an issue. And it's debated with the London government. They send secret coded messages back to the Home Army in Warsaw. And the Home Army is saying we need to do it then. The Polish government in exile is saying we need to do it then. And even the communist Poles, who are being instructed by Moscow, kind of jump the gun. And they actually set this thing off a couple of hours before W hour, which was the hour they were supposed to uprise on August 1st. Now, here's the other thing too. The Germans are just starting to evacuate Warsaw in front of the massive Soviet army, which is heading their direction. So they are already pulling out. The problem here is that when the message gets out, it is so late in the day to all of these various battalions and units of the underground in Warsaw. It is 5:00 p.m. Well, by the time it gets distributed to all these groups, the Nazis have a curfew that is set at 7:00 at night. Anybody seen moving on the streets of Warsaw is going to be what? Shot. So unfortunately, a lot of the messages don't get out until the morning of August 2nd. So assembling all of these groups takes some time. The very first week, though, here's the thing. We always think that this uprising was a complete catastrophe for the Poles and it was a failure. Actually, within the first week, it was very successful. The Poles were able to take over the telephone exchange, the Prudential skyscraper, and they even went into a small concentration camp that held some of the leftover Jews from the Warsaw Ghetto, and they were able to free them. And as you can imagine, when they freed many of those Jews from that little camp, the surviving Jews from the Warsaw Ghetto, they're like, yeah, we'll fight with you. Yeah, we'll help you out. So many of them were drafted right into the ranks of the Home Army. Yeah, and as you had observed, Ann, you know, many of the Home Army were women and children. They felt this patriotic duty, regardless of age. They wanted to get rid of the Nazis. They wanted to take Warsaw back. They wanted to take their beautiful city back. And so there was a huge patriotic movement, especially within the first week or so of the uprising. However, after about the second week, you see, the uprising was only supposed to last about 3 days. And unfortunately, there's no response from the Soviets. Nothing. So the Poles are like, we're kind of left on our own. We don't have any help from the Western Allies either. We keep sending coded radio messages to the London government saying, please help us. They even asked to have that Polish airborne unit that you saw Flint point out dropped in to Warsaw, which probably would have meant they would have been killed. But they very much wanted some sort of support from either the Soviets or the Western Allies. They were just like, just give us something. And after that second week, the Governor General, the German Governor General, who is named Ludwig Fischer, decides to call up reinforcements. These reinforcements are particularly nasty groups of the German army. One of these groups was called the Durlanger Brigades. These were groups of basically Russian defectors who'd gone over to the Nazis. They were also groups of, they were called Ukrainians, but they all weren't ethnically Ukrainians, who were very, very anti-Semitic. There were prisoners, including many murderers, that the Nazis had taken out of prison and put into these units, okay? If you all recall, with the war going on in Ukraine right now, the Soviets, or the Russians have been using groups like this too. We've probably heard about some of these. These guys absolutely have no compunctions about murdering civilians and just killing people outright. So the German army kind of sets these guys loose. And then we also have the SS unit, right? And we all know about them, including the Einsatzgruppen, the people that came behind the German army when they went east. And their sole job for every town, find Jews or Bolsheviks or Poles or anybody they didn't like and just kill them. So that was their job. The Hermann Göring Division, which is also a huge army unit of the German army, is brought up from the south, from Silesia and that area, to help reinforce and put down this uprising in Warsaw. So now the Germans have called in about everything they can into Warsaw to put down this uprising. Think about this for a second, too. The Germans, when they go in to put down this uprising, they don't care about civilian lives, right? What? They don't care. They don't care about the Polish buildings in Warsaw, any of the structures, monuments, the beautiful cathedrals. They don't care. Destroy them all. So the Poles, though, are fighting a very different type of battle, which is one that's not going to be able to match that. They want to preserve their city, right? They're not going to want to destroy their city. They're trying to preserve the civilian and protect the civilian population. That's the job of the Home Army. And they also want to make sure that they can establish a free Poland here, too. So they really are kind of at a disadvantage compared to this ruthlessness that the Nazis are going to bring down on them. Yes?
This time frame for this is what, in 44?
August 1944,
So
September.
it's after the D-Day is based.
Yes.
So it's holding up forces on the east side of Germany.
Yes.
From moving west to fight the
Yeah.
Allies.
And that is one of the benefits. That was one of the benefits to the uprising, but unfortunately didn't quite last long enough, to help in that area. In September, the circle started to tighten. As I mentioned, the Nazi policy of just total destruction. In some of the stories, if you've ever read any of the stories, there's an excellent book by Norman Davies called Warsaw 44. And we have it in our library here. So if you ever want to check it out. But the individual memoirs from some of the individuals who survived here, just some horrible stories about what took place. Even these Derlanger brigades going into these hospitals. So, of course, the Polish Home Army had hospitals set up where they were treating their wounded, but not just wounded Home Army. They're treating wounded Polish civilians, men, women, and children. These Derlanger brigades go in there. They drag everybody out, man, woman, and children, nurses, nuns, and they just shoot them in the streets. They just execute them and kill them. Also, as we know, if you really want to defeat a population in a city, you take away their utilities, you take away their infrastructure. So already much of the water in Warsaw has been busted open. The electricity is down. Food and medicine and fuel is all completely cut off to the city by the Nazis. One of the things that the Poles found was the center city had been left alone by the Nazis. They were mainly attacking into what they call a Stare Miasto, the old town portion. The old town is almost completely flattened by the end of August by all of the action that takes place there. The way that they found to get out and pretty much get most of the Home Army soldiers from point A to point B so they could continue this battle was the sewers. And some of these stories are also terrifying too. We think of, okay, well, you're walking through these sewers and you have enough room and you're wading through water and everything. No. Some of the sewer lines, they could only get children to move through because they were only about 2 feet by 2 feet large. Can you imagine crawling through that, all the sludge and muck in there? And then the absolute horror of knowing that above you are the Nazi soldiers, some of whom might open up a manhole at any time and fire a flamethrower down there or throw a grenade down there or something like that. And that did happen too. But they were able to get most of them to the center city, which is kind of their last holdout. You can see the areas that have been taken by the Nazi troops there along the west bank of the Vistula. So there's another myth we have, and that myth is the Allies didn't help. Well, actually, we tried, but this was very difficult. One of the things was there was a huge focus going on in the West because of the landings at D-Day. Most of the 8th Air Force was tied up in their bombing campaign. The RAF, finally, towards the latter part of the uprising, they send some flights over to drop some supplies. The bravest pilots for the RAF were the Polish pilots, because they obviously had a good reason for wanting to complete these flights. But the flights were incredibly long. They're flying out of Italy all the way to Warsaw. It's about 1,700 miles round trip. And they're flying over enemy territory. So a lot of these aircraft were shot down, planes were killed, and there never were enough of these supply drops to really make a difference, of about half of which fell into the hands of the Germans anyway. So the ones that were able to get to the poles, it just wasn't enough. But we did attempt to help.
So did they even have, for 1,700-mile round trip, did those planes have enough fuel to last that?
They did, but just barely. They would have to put in what they called Tokyo tanks, extra tanks of fuel inside the bomb bays of the aircraft. The other problem was Stalin would not allow FDR or Churchill to use Russian-controlled airfields in the East, okay? And he refused that until the very end, and then at the very end he finally said, okay, you can use some of them. And we'll talk a little bit more about Stalin and what's going on there with him. But 200 tons, as you can imagine, is not going to be enough to supply any group of people with food, fuel, weaponry, medicine, that kind of stuff. So in October, there is finally no choice for the Home Army. They have been completely surrounded, cut off. They see what is happening to the civilian populace in Warsaw. And Komorowski meets with the German commander, and he says, here's the thing. I'm willing to surrender my people in order to save Warsaw and to save the civilian population if you agree to treat us as an actual army. Because how would the Nazis typically treat partisans and guerrillas? Yeah, as enemies, right? As some sort of bandits or criminals, and they would just take them out and shoot them and kill them. He is able to secure a deal with him. Now later, about 2 or 3 months later, the Nazis kind of renege on that deal, and they take many of those surrendered Home Army Polish prisoners, and they take them to concentration camps, or they execute them, or they torture them to get information. Hitler is so angered about this uprising that he orders that Warsaw be completely destroyed, flattened. And so anywhere from, again, 85 to 90% of the city is completely destroyed. The East Bank, a little bit of the Praga neighborhood, that area survived. But for the most part, if you go to Warsaw today, almost everything you see has been rebuilt, completely rebuilt. And the Poles have done a wonderful job of it. They really have. I mean, it shows great pride that they were able to bounce back from World War II like this and from communist rule during the, Cold War era and rebuild their city. It is one of the most beautiful cities in Europe, if you ask me. Yeah, yeah. So then there's this myth, of course, and there's these complications and controversies about how come the Soviets didn't help the Poles. Well, there's two sides to this. Historians are kind of taking a look at the fact that there's some validity to what the Soviets say, but there's also excuses. There's a lot of excuses. As early as August 1st, Stalin said to the Red Army as they're approaching Warsaw, cease operations. Now, Stalin and the Red Army commanders argued that 6 miles short of entering Warsaw, they encountered heavy German resistance. Actually, they did not at Warsaw. Where they encountered heavy German resistance was south of Warsaw. So why that means the army that's moving towards Warsaw has to stop, I don't know. Stalin told the Western Allies his forces were encountering strong resistance from German reinforcements, and he had to outrun the supply and support lines. And there was some truth to that. Remember, that happened to the American army too shortly after D-Day, Patton's army. So there was some truth to the fact they had moved so quickly through eastern Poland that the Red Army had run out of their supply lines and they need to pause and resupply. The Red Army did not move into Warsaw, though, until September 11th, when basically the uprising is over. It's already been lost. Secretly, though, Stalin called the AK, the Home Army, a handful of criminals who are enemies of the Soviet Union. Okay, now think about his logic here. He knows that the majority of the people in Warsaw, the majority of Poles, want to take Warsaw and want to take Poland back as a democracy, as their own country. But to Stalin, he figures that if the Nazis do his dirty work and finish off this uprising, he can come in with his Moscow communist-supported Polish group and install them in power instead. And that's exactly what he does, as we know. So, in some ways, there is an argument that he did this deliberately in order to make sure that Poland and Warsaw, its capital city, would be his for the taking and for the communists. It was around 40,000 or so within the Warsaw area, but it was much larger within, other areas of Poland too. There were additional groups that were in cities like Krakow and areas like that. So, yeah. Again, like I said, the thing that blew my mind when I was walking through Warsaw last month was just how gorgeous this city is and how much rebuilding had to take place. And in many of the areas like the Old Town, the Poles really put a lot of work into recreating the buildings that had been destroyed that were there. They took whatever parts of those old buildings still existed and they built new facades on them. They built new basements and new attics and new roofing and everything, sidewalks and the whole deal. While I was there, as I mentioned, the anniversary was kind of over, which I was really, like Flint said, he was sad that he missed those anniversaries he wanted to be at. I was kind of bummed that I was a little too late for these as well. The August 1st anniversary is very well known in Warsaw, because what people do, exactly 5 p.m. on August 1st, the entire city stops for a minute. Everything, traffic, people walking, as you can see in the photo in the upper left-hand corner, and there's a moment of silence, a minute of silence that takes place for the uprising, in remembrance of the uprising. The memorial that they built, and I think it was built in the 1990s, is an incredible memorial. It has a group of Polish Home Army soldiers emerging from the sewers, weapons in hand, men, women, children. Amazing. And of course, the Kotwica, the various anchor symbol, which represents the uprising, was everywhere, along with the red and white ribbons, like you see here in the display, and the flag of Poland. So the Warsaw people, Warsavians as they call them, were very, very prideful of this event. Even though it was a catastrophe, even though it was a tragedy, to them it represented this moment where they took it upon themselves, ordinary Polish people, men, women, and children, to try and seize their city, try and take their country back from both the Nazis and the Soviets. And this is a very tragic statue that exists outside the Old Town walls. It's called the Littlest Insurgent. And it is, in fact, dedicated to the children, many of who were killed, many of who were couriers, delivered messages, crawled through those tiny sewers, as I mentioned, brought food or medical supplies to the Home Army soldiers while they were fighting. There's even some evidence that some of these younger people even picked up guns and fought themselves, or they threw grenades or Molotov cocktails or whatever, even though they might have been only 6, 7, 8 years old. So, yeah. So tragic. But it was an incredible experience, and for somebody like myself, Polish American who has family, it was something. So thank you. a few questions. I know for time, we probably don't want to go too long, but if somebody has some questions, or even I might be able to answer some stuff from Flint's presentation too, if you had some questions about that, I'll give it a shot.
What about the artifacts?
Oh, the artifacts, yeah, various items here. As you can see, the rogativka, which is a very traditional Polish army hat. Szabla, saber. And on there it says Bog, honor, Ojczyzna, I think is how that's pronounced. It's God, honor, country, basically. I've got the German helmet, again, with the Polish ribbon on it, which they captured again, German helmets and German clothing, and they were wearing them with the eagle badge in order to distinguish themselves. The armband, which was worn, as you saw in some of those pictures. Yeah, so just some various items, and you all are welcome to come up here and take a closer look at these when you have a chance. Question?
Did you get any sensing from the people you talked to in Poland or what they view is going on in Ukraine? And whether or not they're next in line?
Yeah, yeah. And it kind of depended on which generation or which group you spoke to. Some of the younger generation, like some of our younger generation here in our country, are just kind of checked out, and they just think, you know, some of them are just anti-everything, you know. The generation 30s, 40s, 50s, those people, they definitely see Russia as a threat. And the interesting thing was I spoke to a few guys who were in the Polish army, and the Polish military has got quite the kind of bravado. They actually are almost like some of these guys in the army where, you know, I guess it's typical of all soldiers, but they're almost like with the Russians, they're almost like, bring it on, you know. They're like, we've got one of the most powerful armies, and they do in NATO right now. The Poles do, and of course we have a lot of American bases over there. So they're almost like, yeah, if they want trouble this time, we're ready for them. You know, it's kind of their attitude. And then the older generation, the much older generation that lived through the communist era and World War II, they definitely see the Russians as a threat, but they also are a little bit wary of NATO and the Americans. Because remember, there's a large part of that generation that feels like the Allies let them down during World War II. So some of them are kind of like, you know, we don't know who to trust, but we definitely don't like the Russians. So we have history with them, yeah.
Any final questions?
So the flag, you know, I did let them down. Churchill primarily. Want to talk about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, after the war is over, obviously, well, even towards the end of the war, Churchill is very scared of this idea of losing Stalin's support for the war. And he knows that in order to grant credibility to the London government in exile and a Polish democracy, that could cause Stalin to make things worse or totally lose support for the Eastern forces that are challenging the Nazis towards the end of the war. So it was kind of a sellout in some ways, you know. And many of the Poles that had gone to England, including the London government in exile, the Polish fighter squadrons, the Polish soldiers who were serving under the British Army and everything, were extremely disappointed about that. You know, they felt like England, the British government had basically sold out their country to the Soviets. Yeah, yeah. He did too. He didn't want to break waves, so yeah, 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 yeah.
Yeah, I have a question. I know of a family that pretty much their entire family between 1900 and 1920 had moved from Poland to the United States. Was there some sort of indication that things were not going very well and people were getting out?
Well, there was lots of things going on in Poland. Like a large part of my family immigrated in the 1860s. And at that time, Poland was partitioned by Prussia, Russia, and Austria-Hungary. And if you take a look at the actual immigration records at Ellis Island, they asked my great-great-grandfather, they said, "Where are you from?" And he said, "Austria-Hungary." They didn't ask him who he was, because he would have said Polish, because they were underneath the control of those countries. So a lot of Poles immigrated during that time because they didn't want to be, there were uprisings then at that time. There were rebellions against the Russians and Prussians and Austrians. But throughout its history, I mean, you flash forward to World War I, and after World War I, like you were talking about, 1920, around that time, they have to fight for their liberation again. Under the Treaty of Versailles, they're granted that there's going to be another Poland's going to exist after World War I, so they recreate the borders. And then there's fights against the Bolsheviks in the 1920s. So there was constant upheaval. And so I could see a lot of reasons why people might have immigrated to the United States from, Poland during those times. So not necessarily that they could read the future and they could see that the Nazis or the Soviets were going to attack, but all kinds of other reasons too. Yeah. There were wars with Ukraine. There were, all kinds of stuff going on.
Well, Don, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Dziękuję. Dziękuję.
And look at what we have here. Excellent, too.
Part of the agreement of World War II was that the Soviet Union shoved the border west.
Yes.
Are there Poles that say, hey, we got to take this back?